Well, thanks very much, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Well, of course, 2021 is the centenary of the birth of, as David pointed out, one of my predecessors as president of the Western Front Association, John Terraine, who actually was the founding president back in 1980. And this talk this evening is part of the WFA's celebration stroke commemoration of John Terraine's centenary year. I should have given this lecture earlier in the year. I had to substitute another one with a John Terraine theme at the last moment because lockdown problems. I left the memory stick with this lecture on it plugged into my computer at work. I was then on the train home and wasn't able to get back in for another 3 months or whatever it was, so slightly delayed. I should actually say the title of this lecture, as you can say, is John Terraine as a Military Historian Revisited. I've actually given a lecture on John Terraine as a military historian before, and some of you may have heard it. I've given it at various branches, for example. But what I've done for this one is to go back and go through it and add a considerable amount of new material, including about John's feud, if I can put it that way, with Basil Liddell Hart that David alluded to earlier. So this is actually a substantially new lecture. I hope that this will appear in printed form in Stand 2. I suspect it'll be next year now, but this will certainly appear in print at some stage. Well, for my money, John Terraine is one of the most significant military historians of the First World War. Speaking purely personally, he's one of the biggest influences on my writing about the Great War. I still remember the shock when I read the phrase, "the victory won by Haig's army on the Somme in 1916, which is taken from his biography of Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier, published in 1963. And I read that as a postgrad at the University of Leeds in the early 80s. And coming from someone who coming at it from a point of view of someone who had been brought up on the lines led by donkeys approach. I was actually weaning myself off of it by that stage, but see such a strident statement of a completely different way of viewing the Somme to the one that I was accustomed to, it made me stop and think. Now, I would say that I didn't and don't agree with everything that John Terraine wrote. But I have built upon his work, and in some respects, I think I've moved beyond it. But it still remains an immensely significant figure in my intellectual development. And indeed, when I wrote my biography of Douglas Haig, first published in 2011, John's book, Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier, was the gold standard of Haig biography that I had in mind. Well, from a very young age, John Alfred Terraine's life was defined by the Great War. He was born in London in 1921 and thus grew up in the period when Britain was struggling to come to terms with the legacy of 1914 to 18. His father, Charles William Terraine, had enlisted in the ranks of the 3rd County of London Yeomanry, the sharpshooters, in August 1914. He served in Gallipoli, where he was badly wounded in the lung, and later served on the Western Front in the 8th King's Liverpool Regiment. Now, Charles Terraine died when his son was only 6, and John regarded him as a victim of the war. And contrary to public myth, the entire country in the interwar period was not swept up with a tide of pacifism. Of course, there was this quite widespread view the war had been a futile waste, but there was another strand of thinking, a patriotic view of the war, which in an extreme form gave birth to a book called The Crown of Honour, being stories of heroism, gallantry and devotion from the Great War of 1914 to 18. And John Terraine was awarded this as a school prize in 1933. Terraine was much later to write, unfortunately, the act of sweeping away this sort of rubbish the Crown of Honour led to opposite extravagances. In other words, the disenchanted, so-called lions led by donkeys school of thought. Weaned on such soft diet as the Crown of Honour, John Terraine continued, and appetised afresh by the sharper flavoured victuals of the disenchanted, I spent a long time with myths. And it was on encountering the work of Basil Liddell Hart, later a fierce critic of Terraine's work, this marked a turning point in John Terraine's intellectual development. My deep interest in the First World War began just 20 years ago when I was still at school. Terraine wrote to Basil Liddell Hart in 1958 and was started by reading your book on Foch. For the first time, the Great War assumed for me an intelligible shape. I have come to disagree with you on various matters since then, but I shall not forget this debt that I owe you for first dispelling the intense obscurity of these events. By the late 1950s, Terraine had come to believe that if the First War was to be understood, myths, no matter how authoritative, had to be swept aside. And indeed, he was to devote his career as a historian to attacking myths of various sorts. Should actually say here that I've been very fortunate to be the first historian to look at John Terraine's private papers, and his partner Cathy Stevenson, I believe, is watching this evening, and many thanks to Cathy to giving me access to these. I've also looked through the correspondence between Terraine and Liddell Hart in the Liddell Hart archives of King's College London, all of which I think has added to a much more rounded view of John Terraine's work as a historian. And there'll be quite a number of quotes from correspondence between the two men, and indeed Terraine's correspondence with other people in the course of the evening. Well, John Terraine argued that the conditions on the Western Front meant that there were no shortcuts to victory. The indirect approach advocated by the likes of Churchill was not a solution. In France and Flanders, industrialized warfare, the toughness of the German army, and the lack of flanks to turn made an attritional strategy inevitable, Terraine argued. The British army laboured under a number of handicaps. They were junior partners in a coalition dominated by the French. The army of 1914 was, by continental standards, small, focused on colonial warfare, and ill-equipped for the battles to come. In Terraine's words, the British army, from commander-in-chief to drummer boy, had to be formed and trained in the field, in the face of a powerful, skillful, well-equipped and determined enemy. It is asking a lot. Yet in 1918, this army took the lead in defeating the Germans under the command of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. And Terraine argued that the victories of the 100 Days of 1918 could not be separated from the attritional campaigns that had preceded it, 1915 to 1917. These wore down the German army and made victory possible. And for Terraine, there was no doubt about Haig's status as a great captain. Excuse me. Well, Terraine's ideas first appeared in print in the late 1950s in a series of articles eventually published as The Western Front in 1964. His first book, Mons, The Retreat to Victory, was published in 1960. In many ways, Mons was an old-fashioned piece of operational military history, well-written, generally dependable, solidly based on official histories and published memoirs and the like. As it appeared a few years earlier, it would unlikely to have excited much attention, but it appeared at what Terraine described as the beginning of probably the most respectful decade in British history. Now, the 1960s a period of social change, of the questioning of traditional values and mores. So a series of books appear, such as Leon Wolf's In Flanders Fields and Alan Clark's The Donkeys, as well as the musical play, later film, Oh, What a Lovely War. Now, these presented the First World War as futile and generalship as disastrous. Well, actually, they said little that had not been said in the 1930s. These arguments were presented to a new audience. Such books, damningly described by Terraine as instant history, did not have it all their own way. Cyril Foole's First World War, a well-balanced and accessible book written by a distinguished military historian and a veteran of the war, appeared in 1960. But Foole's moderation and good sense did not have the same impact as the shriller tones of the likes of Alan Clark. And Foole's wasn't really prepared to get involved in debate. John Terraine, by contrast, emerged as the principal enemy of the instant historians. Now, Terraine felt deep anger at books that he did not hesitate to denounce as rubbish, mercilessly pointing out their factual errors, dubious interpretations, and suspect sources. And he continues to correct and confront those with whom he disagreed for over 30 years, well into the 1990s. Now, Terraine's decision to take on the instant historians on their own ground, in popular and widely read books, in newspaper articles and letters, in television scripts, rather than in the obscurity of academic journals and or university seminars, I think was really very important indeed. Terraine was the most important revisionist, although his friend and admirer, Corelli Barnett, Bill Barnett, of course, formerly of the Western Front Association, he also took this line, but I think John Terraine was by far and away the more important of the two. So in other words, people who went to bookshops or public libraries could find books which took a very different line from that of Alan Clark. Now, one thing that struck me while working in John's papers is I had not appreciated previously the sheer volume of journalism that he carried out. It's not just through his books and articles, he also that his views came across. He also reviewed a large number of books in the national press, and his review of The Donkeys was described as one of the rudest reviews in history, and it's certainly pretty rude. His review of John Williams' 1962 book on the French mutinies is wonderfully dismissive, consisting of a discourse on the mutinies followed by a mere 2 sentences that discuss the book under review. A brisk journalistic essay which leaves no harpy unpainted, includes no evidence that is not telltale. Perhaps one day soon, a historian will tackle the theme. That makes me wince. Well, for some, Terraine's line of argument was absolutely outrageous. Just like Douglas Haig, John Terraine was capable of provoking anger and unreason. As late as 1991, over 30 years after his views first entered the public sphere, one of his readers wrote to Terraine asking him, "Why do you persist in defending the indefensible? I'm genuinely puzzled at your attitude to Haig." And in the 60s and 70s, it was open season on him. And a surprisingly common line of attack was that as Terraine was too young to have served in the Great War, it was outrageous that he should dare write about it. And a self-evidently stupid argument that undermines the entire rationale of history. There'd be no one writing on Roman history, for example, if you applied that rule. Now, Benny Green, a jazz musician and broadcaster whose credentials for pontificating on military history are not readily apparent, wrote in The Spectator in 1976 that he disagreed with the Terraine ideology. Interesting choice of words, but it's an extremely awkward argument to circumvent. Reviewing a rather unreliable war memoir, Eric Hiscock's The Bells of Hell Go Ting-a-ling-a-ling, Green wrote, "It is a positive relief to be able to hold on to a few facts that even a Terraine cannot throw out of court. Whether these facts concerned the lions led by donkeys myth in its purest form. Not surprisingly, he refiled this review in his myths folder in his papers. He also found himself attacked by some veterans of the Western Front for his interpretations, but he also actually had a number of people who had served in the Great War writing to him, praising his work, and effectively saying, I've been waiting for someone like you to reflect the way that we thought about the Great War while it was going on. So Terraine really polarized opinion among the general public and among veterans of the Great War. Well, his reception by the, what I might call the military history establishment was mixed. Though not an academic, undoubtedly one of the most influential military historians in the 50s and 60s, writing on the First World War, was Basil Liddell Hart. Now, Liddell Hart had spent brief but traumatic periods on the Western Front as an infantry subaltern in the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, and his initial credulous adulation of British generals had by the 1930s tended to disillusionment, and he turned into one of the foremost critics of British High Command in the 1920s and 1930s. But his initial dealings with John Terraine in 1958 were constructive. Liddell Hart congratulated him or complimented him on his most interesting and able article on the Battle of Amiens, and he admired another of Terraine's articles on Passchendaele, describing it as balanced. Terraine, Liddell Hart thought had a desire to get at the truth that is most refreshing. And in the light of the later hostility between the two men, it's richly ironic that at this stage, Liddell Hart regarded Terraine as someone to whom he could pass the baton of research into the First World War, because he basically said in the letter he didn't think he had time to go back to his studies on the Great War, and it's good that someone like Terraine was picking them up. Well, Liddell Hart offered to let Terraine work in his historical files, which included correspondence and notes of conversations with the likes of Sir James Edmonds, the official historian of the First World War. Well, Terraine was at first self-confessedly diffident, given their disagreement on the Great War, but Liddell Hart generously reiterated the offer. In the event, he was unable, Terraine was unable to travel to Liddell Hart's home for about 18 months, given he still had a day job at the BBC. He basically did not attempt to earn a living solely from his pen until the mid-1960s. He was working on his book on Mons, and he was distracted by some family matters. But in the meantime, he had some fruitful correspondence with Liddell Hart, in which Liddell Hart was generous in sharing information on Hague and Passchendaele. Terraine visited Liddell Hart at his house in Medmenham in Buckinghamshire on 11th of June 1960. The latter evidently regarded this as a success, because his next letter was addressed to Dear Terraine, which was a step up in intimacy from his previous salutation, Dear Mr. Terraine. Both men seemed to enjoy their conversation, with Terraine thanking his host for his insights on Hague, and they subsequently exchanged some friendly and informative letters on the subject of Edmonds. But crucially, however, Liddell Hart seems to have gathered the impression that Terraine intended to return on another occasion to look at more material. And this was to cause an acrimonious and public exchange when their relationship broke down in 1963. But in the short term, Terraine's failure to return to Medmenham didn't disrupt the harmony between the two men. As late as 2 years after his visit to Liddell Hart's place, Liddell Hart wrote to congratulate John Terraine in very friendly terms on his latest article in History Today, pointing out that he had covered similar ground in his pre-war book, The Ghost of Napoleon. Well, this cordial relationship came to an abrupt end with the publication in 1963 of Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier. In 1916, the then Lieutenant B.H.L. Hart wrote a short book on his experiences as an infantry officer during the Battle of the Somme, during which he was wounded and gassed. And in it, he revealed himself as naive and frankly credulous. He was only 20 years old and prone to hero worship. He lavished praise on high command, including Douglas Haig, who he described both as a very great general and the greatest general Britain has ever owned. Well, the next few years, Basil Hart turned himself into the enfant terrible of British military thinking, Liddell Hart. And as part of this process, which I think was a manifestation of disillusionment in extreme form, he turned against his former idol, became an outspoken critic of Haig. By 1935, he was writing privately of Haig as a man of supreme egoism and utter lack of scruple, who, to his overwhelming ambition, sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men, a man who gained his ends by trickery of a kind that was not merely immoral, but criminal. Very strong words. Alex Danchev, Liddell Hart's biographer, argued that he underwent a profound crisis in Mametz Wood on the night of 17th, 18th July 1916, being shelled, panicked and gassed, and it haunted Liddell Hart for the rest of his life. Another leading expert on Liddell Hart, Brian Bond, who knew Liddell Hart personally very, very well, finds this view credible. It's certainly plausible that Liddell Hart came to blame Haig personally for his trauma when in 1963 he was faced with Terraine's robust defense of the BEF's commander-in-chief. His objectivity vanished and his relationship with the book's author changed abruptly. In 1960, Terraine had predicted to Liddell Hart that Haig was a subject on which I suppose it is most unlikely we shall agree, and this proved to be all too accurate. Well, in April 1963, Liddell Hart compiled some notes on what he thought was a most perplexing book. He recognized that actually, in many ways, it was very able. There was some good analysis. He attacked what he described as the things that Terraine had omitted or distorted, and actually went as far as claiming that Terraine was being dishonest in the way that he presented his defence of Douglas Haig, and in words which were repeated by more than one of his correspondents. The book was described as a counsel for the defence rather than being a true biography. And Liddell Hart's anger was such, he went as far as to claim, in effect, that the past 40 years of his life had been wasted, in the sense that he'd been trying to sort of, bring a more objective view of the First World War, but this book was totally one-eyed and unobjective. In short, he regarded the message of Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier, as a personal affront. Well, Liddell Hart's catalogue of Terraine's omissions and errors makes some telling points, such as Terraine's failure to mention the substantial sum of money that Haig had lent Sir John French, his military superior, before the war, which was certainly an ethically dubious act. But others of Liddell Hart's points were somewhat less convincing. Terraine later defended his omission of the claim that Haig had described the machine gun as a quote, much overrated weapon, on the grounds, which are absolutely correct, that there's no evidence that Haig ever said any such thing. But of course, Liddell Hart would not accept that. He saw this as being a whitewash job. Well, the notes that Liddell-Hart provided were fair up to a point. The book undoubtedly is overly favourable to Haig, but they ignored the very real qualities of the book. And Liddell-Hart's accusation of dishonesty aimed at John Terraine was grossly unfair and disproportionate. Liddell-Hart took particular exception to Terraine's notes on casualties, which appeared, I seem to remember, as an appendix to the book. In this, Terraine thanked Liddell-Hart for letting him examine his files, which he considered to have a bearing on casualties at Third Eve. His interest having been piqued by Liddell-Hart's claim is an article of suppression and distortion of casualty figures in the official history. I have to state, Terraine went on in the book, I have found nothing in them which could stand as evidence in any serious impartial historical examination. What they did show was the capricious nature of Sir John Edmonds, indeed in the official historian. Indeed, in previous correspondence, Terraine and Liddell-Hart were in broad agreement on this point. Well, Liddell-Hart was clearly angered by Terraine's somewhat offhand comments. Responded in his notes by claiming that Terraine had only visited his files because he had been urged to do so by Lord Haig and other individuals. And in a letter to the Times, he repeated that Terraine had made no effort to visit until June 1960 and contradicted Terraine's account in Douglas Haig by asserting that far from selecting the files for him to read, he left them to go through them with the aid of a card index. Lots of other sort of stuff like that appeared in the letter to the Times. And Liddell-Hart concluded, this casualist did not convey the feeling that his visit was made in a genuine spirit of inquiry to the facts of the casualty figures. Terraine replied, first of all, by saying that Liddell-Hart basically got it wrong, that he said, I was most grateful since I could not and do not see how I could have achieved anything otherwise unless Liddell-Hart had handed the files to him to read. There was no question of my returning. Well, Liddell-Hart does not emerge well from this episode. And John Terraine, I think, could have done a little bit better. His work was not primarily based on archival work. His exploitation of the Haig papers then at Beamerside were a partial exception, but further research into the files at Medmenham would undoubtedly have strengthened the book. And he gave rather a hostage to fortune by making a sweeping comment about the contents of Liddell-Hart's records without having viewed all the relevant files. I suspect that Terraine preferred to work from the comfort of his flat in London rather than make the then, I think, tedious journey to rural Buckinghamshire by public transport. Liddell-Hart, of course, befriended many younger historians, but Terraine seems to have proved resistant to his charms, which is perhaps another black mark as far as the sage of Medmenham was concerned. Well, what happened next is relatively well known, thanks to John Terraine's own writing, but I can add more flesh to the bones. Liddell-Hart organised a clandestine campaign to attack Terraine's biography of Douglas Haig. He telephoned and wrote to at least 8 individuals to egg them on to attack the book in print, sending at least some of them his notes on the book. The campaign had only mixed success. One of those who was lobbied, Alistair Horn, passed on to Terraine an extract from Liddell-Hart's letter. John Terraine withheld the name of his source in Smoke and the Fire when he quotes this. I think since all 3 men are now dead, I don't think there's any problem about revealing that it was Alistair Horn who did that. Well, in his review, Alistair Horn highlighted some of Liddell-Hart's criticisms, but overall the tone was balanced, describing Terraine's analysis as often brilliant. Michael Howard, who I actually talked to about this just a few months before he sadly died about two years ago, also received the notes. And in fact, Sir Michael gave me a copy of the notes to look at. So I've actually seen what Liddell-Hart was talking about. But there's only a small echo of them in his often insightful review of John Terraine's book, which actually was an extremely positive review of Douglas Haig, the Educated Soldier. A.J.P. Taylor, who was certainly an admirer of Liddell-Hart, he too gave, I think, a pretty balanced review of the book. So up to a point, at least among the big guns, Liddell-Hart's attempts to influence reviewers of the book were not terribly successful. Where he did score a definite success, however, was with the review written by George Sewell, who was the actor who played Haig in the original stage version of Oh, What a Lovely War. Now, he reviewed the book in Tribune, so the left-wing newspaper, which had, perhaps not surprisingly, taken a very lines led by donkeys, anti-establishment view of generalship in the First World War. And this article, this review rather, reuses Liddell-Hart's words almost verbatim. This is not a detailed reassessment of Haig, Sewell claimed, and Sewell guilelessly gave the game away by referring to notes which Captain Liddell-Hart has kindly made available to me, which he then proceeded to quote verbatim or very likely paraphrase. In his published reply in Tribune, John Terraine pounced on Sewell's public tearing aside of the curtain to reveal Liddell-Hart operating like the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes. Mr. Sewell is the fifth reviewer of my book with whom I know Captain Liddell-Hart to have been in communication, and not the only one who received such notes. I find this attention flattering, if puzzling. Sewell's reply that at least two other reviewers of the book have made exactly the same point, i.e. it was Defence Counsel's brief for Haig of the objective reassessment of him, of course merely reinforced John Terraine's argument. Terraine concluded his rebuttal by quoting a piece written by Haig, written on Haig by his antagonist 2 years earlier, in the process referring to Liddell-Hart's cri de coeur in his notes. Haig's failures in conditions of unprecedented complexity are less remarkable than the extent to which he succeeded through sheer qualities of character. This was the starting point of my book, which thus in effect rounds off Captain Liddell-Hart's 40 years of efforts in this field. I think that's probably game, set and match to John Terraine. Should actually say that later on, George Sewell joined the Western Front Association, completely reversed his position on Haig and the Western Front, and actually became a keen admirer of John Terraine. I remember that at an early, for me anyway, an early branch meeting of the London branch, which I gave a talk. George Sewell was there in the audience. Okay, so it's Liddell-Hart's attempt to shape the debate on Douglas Haig, the Educated Soldier, was only partly successful. While popular writers and non-specialists were quite critical, scholarly writers on the First World War tended to be actually quite impressed by the book. Well, skirmishes between Liddell-Hart and Terraine continued in the 1964 Great War television series, which appeared initially on BBC Two. Both of them were initially consultants, but there was a very public row in which Liddell-Hart resigned by writing to the press, saying in effect that his views had been ignored in favour of Terraine's. Ironically, the episode which caused Liddell Hart to resign on the Somme because of its revisionist flavour, which Terraine had given to it, seems to have had very little impact on the viewing public in terms of them taking away any message at all, apart from the sheer horror of the Battle of the Somme. While looking at John Terraine's work on the First World War, I think it's impossible to escape from the view that he carried a great deal of emotional baggage. In his critical review of Douglas Haig, the journalist Robert Key suggested that Haig was not in fact the father figure Mr. Terraine yearns to make him. Perhaps this touched a raw nerve, particularly in view of what we know about John's father. Terraine responded with a short article in which he accused Key of being a victim of the trauma of the First World War. And Key's emphasis on Terraine's emotional investment in the book was echoed by Alex Danchev nearly 30 years later. Danchev describes Douglas Haig, the educated soldier, as resembling a first skin-shedding autobiographical novel. Well, actually, I'm not sure it does. Certainly in comparison to some of John Terraine's later writings, where he really does wear his heart on his sleeve, I'm certainly struck by the absence of overt emotion in The Educated Soldier. Well, in 1978, it's the turn of John Keegan to turn to the question of Terraine's emotional involvement in the Great War. His review of Terraine's To Win a War, which is about 1918, of course, the 100 Days, published under the heading of Whole Stunt Napu, was one which Terraine found deeply hurtful. It's actually quite funny if you're not the victim of it. Keegan parodied Terraine as the archetypal Tommy. Here he comes now, swinging down the duckboards, tin hat slung, cap comforter over his ears. Keegan recognised the personal cost of Terraine's crusade. There is emotion in his voice, and there are wound stripes on the cuff. The old warrior has suffered for his loyalties. Keegan perceptively identified Terraine as the Enoch Powell of British military historians. Like Powell, Terraine stuck doggedly year in, year out to what he believed was true, despite the unfashionability of his cause and the hostility he aroused. Well, I'd say it's testament to the strong feelings the First World War still aroused in the interwar generation that John Keegan, born in 1934, used very emotional language in his own writings. For example, referring to the British generals as hideously unattractive, whose diaries reveal hearts as flint-like as the texture of their faces. And it's just as emotional, just on the different side of the debate. So Terraine and Keegan are almost polar opposites in the way that they express their views about the First World War. Well, as a very junior lecturer at Sandhurst in the mid-1980s, I remember a far more senior colleague, still around to this day, senior military historian, saying to me that Terraine was, quote, not an academic. Well, given such hostility from parts of the military history establishment, it's not surprising that he developed a somewhat jaundiced view of the academy. In reviewing a book on the American Civil War, for example, he responded to the author's comment that within academic circles there had been debate over whether the Great Civil War arguments were now exhausted, I'm sorry. And Terraine went on to say, this is just the sort of thing that academic historians do debate about. We must not grudge them their simple pleasures. Now, Terraine was always essentially an outsider, never part of the university and Sandhurst-based military history establishment about the First World War. And I think in some ways he reveled in this. In other ways, I think he actually yearned for acceptance. But as we've seen from the very beginning, that there were some academics all along who were prepared to take John Terraine seriously. In 1963, there was a debate in the pages of History Today in which a young lecturer in history, Brian Bond, took on Terraine. And in years to come, Brian Bond was to become a great admirer of John Terraine's work. In his 2000 Lees Knowles lectures at Cambridge, he gave a sympathetic and positive assessment of John Terraine's work while critiquing his limitations and blind spots. However, Terraine's influence was perhaps most marked on a younger generation of military historians. Sometimes his influence was negative, at least in part. Tim Travers formed part of the argument of The Killing Ground, very influential book, first appeared in 1987, as a response to Terraine's work, basically attacking it. But very often it was positive in getting scholars started in the first place. After John Terraine died in 2003, I undertook a small and very unsympathetic straw poll of military historians, and it's on their views on John Terraine. It's surprising how many refer to his books as, to quote one of my correspondents, as a very seminal early influence. He was also directly influential at a personal level. Many examples of his kindness to young historians. One, having been primed to expect an argumentative ogre, instead found a man who was extremely kind, moderate, and informative. And speaking to Kathy Stevenson earlier today, and she confirmed that he actually came, I think, to appreciate the fact that historians of a younger generation, of my generation, indeed people younger than me, became great fans of his work and stopped seeing them as threats, and actually came to enjoy the fact that actually they were basically saying that he had been right all along, and building upon his work to go off in slightly different directions. But what I want to talk about now for the last few minutes is John Terraine's role in our organisation, the Western Front Association. John Terraine first became involved in this thanks to a telephone call in 1980, which opened up a new and very important role as a public historian for him. The call was from John Giles, a retired chemical sales manager and former Conservative local councillor with an ex-service background. Ill health had forced John Giles to take early retirement, and he devoted his time to a near lifelong passion, the Western Front, where his father had served. By 1980, he had published two well-received books, including The Somme, Then and Now. But his main efforts lay in setting up an organisation to commemorate the Western Front. And in July 1980, he contacted a prominent Great War veteran, Lieutenant General Sir John Glubb, and based on the promise of his support, another telephone was made to someone whose works on the Great War I had long admired. This, of course, was John Terraine, who accepted Giles' offer to become the honorary president of the new Western Front Association. And the WFA was formally inaugurated with appropriate symbolism on the 11th of November, 1980. Well, by the early 80s, there was a rising tide of interest in the Great War in Britain. At its inauguration, the WFA had 882 members. A year later, the membership numbered nearly 1,000, and numbers continued to grow into the thousands. We have 6 and a bit thousand today, organised into a number of areas. There were 26 in 1986. And in 2014, Peter Simpkins, who himself was an admirer of John Terraine, a distinguished scholar of the Great War, and my immediate predecessor as WFA president, summarised the importance of the WFA. The WFA currently has 6,000 members and over 60 branches and affiliated organisations in Britain and overseas. It publishes a scholarly journal, Stand To, and plays a very important role in stimulating and maintaining serious public interest in the 1914-18 period at all levels, from the family historian or hobbyist to the academic. And I think this knocks the nail on the head why the WFA is important. It has become a vital bridge between academic history and, to use a slightly unkind term, the wider world of Great War buffs. Given Terraine's ambivalence towards academic work for much of his career, this is a little ironic. Now, John Terraine's appointment as president of the WFA sent a very clear message of the direction of travel of the organisation. Some people came to it from a traditional perspective, inspired, for example, by the war poets. Indeed, in the early days, Stand To regularly included poems by members, one of which remarkably rhymed poems with Owens. From the first, Terraine made no concessions to what he regarded as a forced sentimental view. In his address at the inaugural meeting, he stated, "I cannot view the British contribution on the Western Front with any emotion other than with very great pride." This lecture did not lead, as far as I can tell, to protest via the correspondent columns of Stand To, but his address to the 1982 AGM did provoke an angry response. His subject was the generals, which rehearsed his arguments, which would be familiar to anyone with even a nodding acquaintance with his work. This prompted two letters, one of which stated that the Great War generals were not capable of thinking beyond the use of a horse, while the other denounced that whitewash apology by John Terraine of the inefficient, incapable, inconsiderate, callous gangs of morons called generals. Well, we need to think what would have happened if John Giles had had a different view and had invited another John, John Laffin of British Butchers and Bunglers fame, to become president of the WFA rather than John Terraine. To put it mildly, it would have pushed the WFA in a very different organisation, in a very different direction. It would become, I think, a very different organisation. So along John Giles, John Terraine deserves considerable credit for helping to develop an important avenue for public history of the First World War, through which we would call it a revisionist view of the British Army was disseminated. Well, John Terraine also worked together behind the scenes to ensure the WFA held together through the most difficult period in its entire history. On its formation, John Giles became chairman, but he was plagued by ill health, and in February 1984, he was forced to stand down from his position. And John Terraine was genuinely sad for him. Well, Giles remained on the committee, but this proved to be an unworkable arrangement. And it caused all sorts of problems. Well, enjoying the respect of both sides in the dispute, Terraine urged John Giles to compromise. While holding John Giles in very high regard and sympathising with his position, Terraine was fearful that WFA might simply disintegrate. And in his address in 1986 to the AGM, he paid handsome and deserved tribute to John Giles and called to an end to purely internal warfare. He compared it to a family quarrelling about the will beside the relatively open grave. Except in this case, the open grave is the memory of the Western Front, which is a very considerable grave indeed. Well, the worst of the crisis was over by this stage, and John Giles gradually settled into the role of a much respected elder statesman of the WFA. And John Terraine's tactful but firm handling of his friend and the support he gave the committee was significant factors in keeping the WFA afloat. He saw the WFA as a means of rectifying what he saw as a historic injustice, the denigration of the BEF and its generals, and he was not determined not to let it break apart through internal strife. Finally, where does John Terraine's work on the First World War stand today? Here, I think we need to differentiate between the Terraine thesis, there's no shortcut to victory, that attrition was inevitable, and his views on Haig. In the first, I think actually Terraine has swept the field clean. I can think of no reputable historian on the First World War who would disagree with this argument in its essence that John Terraine put forward. On Haig, the picture is more mixed. There continues to be a pro and anti-Haig schools. I would certainly regard myself as being in the pro-Haig school. There are historians I admire, like Robin Pryor in Australia, who are in the anti-Haig school. But if nothing else, John Terraine helped to shape the debate and move it along. I would agree with the argument that John Terraine rested too much on Haig's final dispatch, which in turn smacks of, after the event, rationalisation. It's clear that Haig did not expect the Western Front campaign to develop along the lines which he later stated in his 1919 final dispatch while the war was going on. I also would say that Terraine overreacted to accusations that Terraine was a military dunce. I think by putting forward Haig as a great captain fit to be viewed alongside the likes of Wellington, for once John Terraine got it wrong, if only for the fact that Haig was in a different category from someone like Napoleon or Lee or whoever. Above all, Haig was a war manager. He was not primarily a battlefield general. And that, I think, is something which Terraine recognised and actually made some powerful arguments in favour of, but nonetheless, it clouded his judgment when it came to his overall assessment as of Haig. Let me finish by quoting the reviews of a naval historian about a book that John Terraine wrote on something other than the Western Front, that is Business in Great Waters, the U-Boat Wars 1916 to 1945. Professor Andrew Lambert declared that Terraine has provided an example of that which is best in popular history, well written, well informed, and offering an opening for further study. I would say that those remarks are also applicable to John Terraine's work on Haig and the Western Front. It is a mark of his significance that academic historians cannot simply dismiss his work, but they have engaged with it, and his work has helped to shape a major historiographical debate. More than any one other individual, he remodeled the historiographical landscape of Britain and the Western Front. John Terraine was an outstandingly significant historian. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Gary, thanks very much indeed for that tremendous insight into the Western Front Association's first president, John Terraine. Ladies and gentlemen, if we'd like to raise our hands electronically as a round of applause, that would be tremendous. And Gary, I can confirm that there's plenty of hands being raised, which is a silent round of applause for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's question and answer time now. So if we can get questions in, that would be tremendous. We've had a couple already, so I'm just going to invite David Muir in the first instance to join us. Part of the questions possibly been touched on in the last couple of sentences of Gary's presentation, but nevertheless, I think that there's still a lot of validity in the question you've raised. Carry on.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for a truly excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I've long been an admirer of John Terraine. I think it was To Win a War that first grabbed me, but you didn't mention all the books. You did show the cover of Smoke and War, but you didn't mention White Heat, and you did mention finally Business in Great Waters. But then again, there's the other book that you wrote, The Right of the Line, which again is potentially controversial, seeing it the praise it gives to the Royal Air Force during World War II. Would you have you any comments that you would like to expand?
Yeah, sure. Well, I didn't talk about those books because that wasn't the subject of the lecture. I could give another completely different lecture on John Terraine's other stuff. Yeah, I mean, John Terraine he's best known for his books on the Western Front, obviously, but actually in his other material, I think he showed he had a greater range, and indeed, had he written less on the Western Front, I think we would have had some very interesting books indeed. His U-boat book, I think, is an extremely interesting foray into naval history, which is particularly, I think, significant because actually it is difficult for non-naval historians to get naval history right. And naval historians tend to be quite a clubby bunch. And if a non-naval historian tries to sort of muss in on the act, they can be quite rude if you get things wrong. John Keegan wrote at least one book on naval history, which has some fairly terrible reviews from naval historians. The fact that you had a very senior naval historian writing very enthusiastically about John's book on the U-boat wars, I think is really quite significant. Tells you an awful lot about John's quality as a historian. The other book one of the other books that you mentioned was The Right of the Line, which is about the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. Well, when I was teaching at the start of the then new Joint Staff College back in the early 80s, early 2000s, one of the key texts used, particularly for RAF students, was that book. And some of them actually, who knew nothing about John Terraine or anything about the First World War, were quite surprised to find he'd written anything on anything else, because they regarded him as being primarily an Air Force historian. Now, what John did with that is basically take the air historical branch narratives and knit them into an overarching book with his own, I think, penetrating insights, which means that book remains incredibly valuable to this day. And it's big comments. In fact, I do remember a historian commenting to me when the book first came out that they thought he tried to do a Douglas Haig on Bomber Harris to sort of rehabilitate him. It didn't quite work because it didn't work in quite the same way. But nonetheless, I think you can see his book about, his writing about Bomber Command anyway, as being an extension of his argument about attrition and so on the Western Front. I could also mention various other books. His book on Trafalgar I very much enjoyed. My single favourite book, which actually I reviewed in Stand 2 quite recently, is The Smoke and the Fire, which came out in the early 80s and consists of a series of essays and thoughts on the Great War, which they will always come in sort of bite-sized chunks. So I think John Terraine, was a very prolific historian. In some ways, I wish he'd written maybe 2 or 3 fewer books on the Western Front, if that would have meant that we would have had more books writing on other subjects. I'd love to have seen him writing a book on the Desert War in the Second World War, for example. But he certainly was. There was more to John Terraine than just writing about Haig and the Western Front.
Yes, thank you. I also very much admire Smoke and Fire, especially the way it contrasts the traditional and new generation generalship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that. Ted, your turn.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Ted. Good to see you.
A lot of that was new to me, so thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to pick up on your comment about a Sandhurst lecturer saying that John wasn't an academic.
Who will continue to remain anonymous.
And then I will pin you to a comment I think I heard you say, that you'd accept John Terraine as an authority for an academic essay, but not someone like Max Hastings or Keegan in his journalistic days. They were all journalists, so what's the difference?
I'm not sure I quite said that, but
Sorry.
right. What are the difference? I suspect the context of speaking about Max Hastings is actually, I quite like Max's book on the First World War, but it's not an original piece of work. It's it's a good overall summary and what have you. If someone actually quoted Max in an essay, I certainly wouldn't put a red line through it or anything. Just my point is that, so I should say that Ted is a former master's student of mine at Wolverhampton, that actually I was looking for people to engage with original research. And so in that sense, I mean, John Terraine was coming out with stuff which is still agenda setting. John Keegan, well, I play very hot and cold about him. To be honest, I knew John. I didn't know him well, but I certainly knew John Keegan. We were colleagues at Sandhurst in the early in the mid 80s. He was not the person who said that about Terraine, incidentally. And I still very much admire some of his work. The Face of Battle remains a seminal book. However, I was really unimpressed by his book on the First World War for all sorts of reasons. And yeah, if you're going to read a general book on the First World War, there are books that are a lot better than that one. Was John Terraine a journalist? I don't think he was. He certainly wrote journalism, but he never wrote, as far as I'm aware, professionally for a magazine or a newspaper. He was an old-fashioned, if I can put it, popular historian, popular in the best sense. He wrote books to reach a wide audience. An independent historian, I think, is a better way of putting it. I didn't read out the quotes because I was slightly running out of time, but Pete Simpkins, in his obituary for John, actually see if I can find it in the script, wrote back in 2003 or 2004 when he died. That's it. Yeah. This is what Pete wrote. Pete might even be in the audience this evening. He said that. Well, this is what I said rather. Since many of the historians who, from the late 1960s onwards, have exploited the archives, have, in Peter Simpkins' words, reached roughly the same general position as he had long occupied, it would appear that John Terraine was blessed with a rare combination of instinctive historical insight, intellectual integrity, and profound common sense. So John was a historian. He could have been a better historian, I think, if he had paid more attention to footnotes at the beginning of his career. His latest books are very full of footnotes. I think he would have been a better historian if he had spent hours in archives, but the man was actually earning a living from his pen from 1964 onwards. He really did not have time to go and spend hours in archives. So he was, I think, a rather old-fashioned sort of historian, and that's a highly effective one. So I would put him in a different bracket from genuine paid-up journalists, people like John Keegan in his later years and Max Hastings.
Gary, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Ted. Right, okay, so we've got a question from Joseph Ogar, but unfortunately I can't get Joseph onto the Zoom. So Joseph's question was, do you know where John Terraine stood with Hubert Gough?
Oh, good question. Actually, no, I can't think of anything he's written on it. No, I'll have to pass that one, but that's an interesting thing to look into. I seem to remember that he accepted that Gough had to go. He accepted Haig's view that Gough had to go in March 1918 because a scapegoat was needed. But I honestly can't remember what he wrote about Gough at Somme and Pascal. So no, sorry, I need to look that up. I mean, it's a bit embarrassing. I ought to know that, having written on Gough, but I can't remember what John Terraine wrote about him. No.
No worries. That's good question. I think it's bold to Google that there, aren't you? So
absolutely, you have. I have to admit my ignorance on that one.
No worries. John Casey. John, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
Hi, Gary. Thanks for
Hi, John.
that very interesting talk. You've touched on this in a bit in your answer to Ted, but since John Terraine was writing largely at the time when the official records weren't available, do you think that his views and conclusions would have been significantly changed in any way had he had access to that information that has started to come out since then?
Well, of course he did, but at second hand, because certainly from the late 60s, early 70s onwards, people were putting some of these views forward. I think another way of putting it is, to what extent did John modify his views as a result of stuff that was coming out from the 70s onwards? He did to a little bit, but one of the problems was that he could be quite defensive, and actually for very good reasons, because people just said some really rude and hurtful things about him, particularly in the 60s, when he was very much at the forefront and coming up with views which some people found very uncomfortable. Some people got extremely angry about. So I remember in a piece which appeared probably in 1986 or 1987 in a book edited by Peter Liddell called something like Home Fires and Foreign Fields, which was a collection of papers from a conference at Sunderland in 1985, I suspect. And John wrote a piece basically restating his views on Haig and generals, and it was really quite defensive. The problem is that he didn't actually write that much on the First World War after White Heat came out, I think in 1982. He moved on to different things, or not about the Western Front anyway. My impression from talking to John and from hearing him give talks at WFA meetings and things like that is that he did, to some extent, take on board some of the new thinking, and he modified his views to a small extent. But I think we go back to the view that Pete Simpkins put forward. I read just a few minutes ago. Since he basically got it right in the first place, it was only sort of nuances that you really needed to put into place. So I think John, as I said, I think if he had been an academic historian in the sense of going and sitting in archives for hours on end, he would have been a very different sort of historian. But I suspect he would have ended up producing much the same sort of work, because actually he got there through instinct, I think, which is not the way to get a PhD, but it nonetheless is, I think, a really admirable quality, because basically he was right. Again, a quote from Paul Harris, who actually wrote a very critical book about Haig, but he wrote in this book that essentially Terraine won the argument. Practically all First War scholars of real substance are Westerners now. So that's not the argument about Haig, but rather the broader Terraine thesis. So John, rare example for historian coming from a good deal of opposition to his views to basically, everybody who knows anything about the subject agrees with him. So, would that happen to my views? Unlikely, but John managed it.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary.
Thanks,
John. Thanks for your question there. Graham Evans. Graham, you're on.
Right, thank you very much. Really good to see you, Gary. I was just looking at this fantastic version of the Somme, which I used for a dissertation for the Royal Colleges of Defence Studies. But my question is, what is your views on John's views on the contribution of the Indian Army on the Western Front?
Oh gosh, that's another one like Gough. I don't remember he writes that much about it. Because if you think that the bulk of the Indian Army, apart from the cavalry divisions, had left by the end of 1915, and of course his main focus is Hague, which of course is C&C is from 1916 onwards. Again, I seem to remember that he broadly follows the Hague line in Educated Soldier, that the Indian Army wasn't up to it, and certainly Wilcox, the commander, wasn't up to it. I suspect that if he was writing that now, in light of the really good stuff which has come out over the last few years from, Gordon Corrigan, George Morton Jack, and various other people, including some Indian historians, he might actually be a bit more nuanced in his view. But again, that's something I'll need to go back and look up, because I don't remember him taking a very strong view rather than following the Hague line.
Okay.
But of all the subjects, I should actually say that that we have changed our minds about the army. We really have changed an awful lot in recent years. Because there's been such good stuff coming out, looking at new sources, new archives, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think it's important in the times that we live in that we do recognise contribution from places around the world in the Commonwealth, Indian Army, New Chapelle Memorial. I had the privilege of going there many years ago with Richard Holmes, and he was making that point that that magnificent Indian memorial at New Chapelle, very few people visit it, and perhaps you and other historians can make a bigger point to that, because it's well worth a visit.
And telling tales out of school, I was talking to an MP, a Midlands MP, who actually was of Asian heritage in the run-up to the centenary, and we tried to get the then Prime Minister David Cameron to host a reception for descendants of Indian Army soldiers to be held on or around the anniversary of Neuve Chapelle. Unfortunately, didn't come to anything. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, just very quickly, forgive me, I was an MP in Parliament at that time, and I was part of the team that tried to persuade David Cameron to do that. But I did make a speech about the contribution of the Sikhs in the Western Front, but we did fortunately go to the 100th anniversary of the Somme. With David Cameron, so we got there for the Somme, but not for Neuve Chapelle. Thank you.
It's great. Well, thanks. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Cheers, Gary.
Useful to know.
Thanks for your question there, Graham. Chris Carnigan has asked this question. Unfortunately, I can't get Chris on the Zoom. Did John Terraine serve in the Second World War?
No, he didn't. He was medically unfit. He tried to join the forces on at least one occasion. I think more than that. So actually, he ended up did a 2-year wartime degree at Oxford during the war, and he then, I think, straight away started working for the BBC in the working for the talks service. So no, and I gather it was a matter of regret that he was never able to serve during the Second World War.
Okay, thanks for that, and thanks to Chris for his written question there. I'm going to do the last couple of questions in a particular order, so Nicholas, just bear with me. I know you asked a question earlier. I'm going to go to Graham first. Graham, your question, Graham Woodall.
Hello, Gary. Great talk again. Thank you. A slightly sort of light-hearted question in a way, where you'll understand the motives. Who out of John Laffin and Alan Clark would you treat with the most contempt or the least respect?
Wow. Being an Arsenal fan, it's like me trying to differentiate between Chelsea and Spurs.
Well, I'm a Spencer Jones fan, so.
Okay. I won't answer that question directly. What I will say is, I think neither of them were good historians of the First World War. I think that Alan Clark was by far the more influential, and so in that sense, I think has done the most damage. I'm not being too strong in using that, because I think John Terraine, to understand where he was coming from. I think you would appreciate his really deep anger at what he called the instant historians of the 1960s. And Alan Clark's book was, I mean, demolished at the time by the likes of Michael Howard, who just described as being, you know, nonsense effectively. But a number of people fell for it. And to this day, it still gets regurgitated. Old John Laffin was far less influential, partly because he was not nearly as skillful a writer as Alan Clark was. But, you know, Alan Clark was, well, whatever your point of view, he was an extremely influential writer. Whether whether you consider he was influential in a positive or negative direction, well, I've made my views clear, but that's up to everybody else to decide what they think.
That's a great answer, Gary, and I promise I shall never use either of them as a reference again. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Thank you. Jeffrey, do you just want to unmute yourself and for the penultimate question?
Gary.
Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello.
Yeah, you're live.
Gary, thank you very much for, as usual, an excellent presentation. My question is about Cyril Falls.
Yes.
I'm a great admirer of Cyril Falls' short history of the First World War, which I think is a beautifully balanced book. And I wonder whether you'd like to comment on it.
Oh, well, it's one of my favourite books on the First World War. It's a bit dated now, of course. And if I was asked to recommend a single volume history of the First World War, it will be David Stevenson's from 2004. But I always add, but don't forget Cyril Falls, because it's written by a combat veteran of the Great War, of course, an official historian. He wrote one of the volumes on sorry,
Ulster Division.
Arras.
Oh yes. He wrote the Ulster Division history, but he also wrote the Arras volume, and I think
the Arras volume,
at least one or two of the Middle East volumes of the official historian. And if you read his book, it is very modern in the sense of he's putting arguments which, you know, would slot into, you know, a revisionist book or a master's essay at this time, and yet it was written in the late 50s, published I think in 1960, which to me says so much about what, I mean, most historians today, you know, are broad agreement along the lines of the Terraine thesis, even if we might disagree over elements of it. But actually, we're getting back to some serious thought about, and also the way that the war was perceived by sort of deep thinkers at the time. And so I discovered Cyril Falls' book when I first went to Sandhurst in 1985, and I wrote a big picture book, the first thing I ever had published. Came out about 2 years later. And I lean very heavily on that, and also on Edmund's short history of the First World War, as us being not only giving the narrative and everything else, but some really good insights. And I've gone back to that book time and time again. I think it was republished by Pen and Sword quite recently, last 2 or 3 years. If you haven't read the book, buy it. And it's, you know, it's still, to my mind, one of the best single volume histories of the First World War, even though it's now 60 odd years old.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Alan Wakefield's just made the point, thanks Alan for this, that Cyril Falls wrote the excellent 2 volumes on Macedonia. So thanks.
Yes, of course. That's what. Also, I think one of the Palestine volumes.
Yeah, I think he did.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Last question. I've deliberately held this to the last, Nicholas, because I think it's a good final question. So take it away, Nicholas, with your question.
What I wanted to ask was, I've perceived in sort of looking at military history in general over the last couple of years, that there seems to have been a lack of future development in the history of the First World War. It was been rather overtaken by the Second World War and other things. And I wonder whether, if you proceed with this reevaluation of John Terraine, that might in itself prompt a further reevaluation of the First World War. I don't know whether my views are misguided or what, but that's
oh well. Thank you. It'd be nice to think it's true. I think that we got a bit sort of First World Warred out during the centenary, to be honest, because so much new stuff appeared. And so I think there would be a bit of fatigue would set in at the end of that. Also, I mean, looking specifically at Haig and the Western Front and all the rest of it, the debate is getting a bit stale. Or at least in terms of the big picture stuff. We're getting some really interesting stuff coming at a lower level, you know, looking at tactics and things like that. But I do wonder whether it's not time to sort of push this to one side. I'm sure that someone will come back to it sooner or later with a fresh set of eyes. But at the moment, I would tend to agree with the argument maybe has run its course. As far as taking it on, my own research and other people are now starting to explicitly compare the First World War to the Second World War. And I think that's a really interesting development. So I'm writing a big book on experience of British and Dominion soldiers in the two World Wars. I'm just about to start doing explicit comparisons of operations. And so certainly I'll be comparing the Western Front with France 1940 and with Normandy and Germany 1944-45. And the more I look at it, the more I'm seeing parallels, but also some subtle differences. So I suspect comparative history will be one way of revigorating the study of operations in the First World War.
Well, I've been reading books on France, Germany, and so on. And I've become aware that there is a lack of comparison, if you like, between operations on the French side and on the British side. And it also seems to me that there is a general perception that if you support the French, then you're anti-British. If you're pro the Americans, then you're anti-British as well. And that there seems to be a dearth of useful comparisons, useful general attempts to see how they cooperated, whereas it just seems, sorry.
No, I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think this sort of silly parochialism, I think this silly parochialism, like supporting your own national football team, it does no one any favours, and it is rather silly. There are real problems about doing genuine comparative history. I mean, obvious ones of language, access to archives, and also it's difficult enough doing one army, let alone doing 2, 3, or 4. So I do think that comparative history, in the sense that you're talking about, is probably a collaborative approach. So, you know, 2 or 3 or more scholars collaborating on a particular project. But you're so right. I read, I can't remember. Sorry, it's getting too late. My brain's numb. A very good book on French army recently, which has got
Fire and Steel.
Fire and Steel, indeed, yeah. Which has got virtually no reference to the British, which is just as annoying as having British books which got no references to the French. Yeah. Actually, I'm not blaming it's Goya, isn't it? Michel Goya. I'm not blaming Goya for not having done that, because I know it's enough getting your hand around one army. But what we need are other people to take the British, the French, the German, the American, etc. Viewpoints to work in all the archives and actually come up with a synthesis. But that is a huge job. I mean, we're only making small progress at the moment, but it's something we definitely need to do.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Nicholas. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for watching this. A brief advertisement for the next webinar in our series, which is on Saturday, the 25th of September at 10 AM UK time. And it's at that rather early hour, because we're having Dr. Amelia Hampton the Western Front Association's ambassador in Australia, talking to us from Australia about bullock or staff planning processes for the Australian operations in April and May 1917. So we're going to have an Australian talking about the Australian planning. It's one definitely to come to, 10 a.m. Saturday the 25th of September. Gary, thanks very much indeed once again for a wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed that, as have hundreds of WFA members, and I'm very grateful for your work. So thanks very much, Gary.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for tonight. On that note, I look forward to having everybody along for future webinars in September and indeed October and onwards. Thanks very much for watching. Good night, everybody.
Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentiers, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentiers, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentiers, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all